You're listening to the Meditation and Attachment Podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome everybody. It's November 12th, 2020 at 7:35 p.m. Pacific time. And this is Meditation and Attachment, Deepening Your Practice. And we've been talking about Vipassana meditation for the last few weeks. We'll continue with that. I've been talking about it in relationship to the Mahasi Sayadaw Progress of Insight, which is his commentary on the Visuddhimagga. And the Theravada path to enlightenment. We talked about the basics of developing sensory clarity, understanding the nature of mind as it's related to the five senses. The pure sensing form of, say, we're talking about the eye, light and form, and then mind making it into something. So you see light and form, and then the mind makes it into a chair or a table or a lamp or whatever it is that you're looking at. And taking this understanding of the basic sensing experience and then begin to examine the experience of self and world, touching into the nature of the self activity, not a solid, ongoing, continuous, unchanging experience. An intrinsic self that exists inside of you somewhere, but a reaction of sensing experience that produces the activity of self, and that tends to take on this I amness, this I am doing this, I am controlling this, I am owning this, this is mine. And then beginning to see that it actually arises based on conditioning, and it arises based on the context or the conditions of the present moment, and that each arising of the sense of self, because it is based on the conditions of the present moment, is different from other arisings of self, and that it isn't intrinsic or constant or ongoing, but that it arises and passes like all other phenomena, which points us to the reflection on impermanence, that both in a large sense and in a small sense, in a macro sense and a micro sense, everything is constantly changing. Sometimes, well, I just remembered at this moment, the first Vipassana class I went to in '92, Katriana Reed saying, the only constant is change. So that you have that sense of that flow, that movement, that constant changing that happens, and yet at the same time we remain in the experience of the present moment, that this sense of time is a construction that helps us organize that, the past, the future. We don't experience the past in the past, we experience it in the present moment. We don't experience the future, we experience the future in the present moment. And then the last consideration there is suffering or unsatisfactoriness or reactivity. 3 levels of that. On the first level, you have this life that you're living in a human body, which is subject to birth and death, to growing old and getting sick. And there's nothing that you can do about that. And then everything arises and passes, everything changes, nothing is permanent. You can't hold on to anything. That's another aspect of that suffering. You try to cling to something and it doesn't last, and so you suffer. So even if you get what you want, it doesn't last, or sometimes you don't get what you want, or sometimes you have to put up with things that you don't want. And then the last is a kind of subtle, constant irritation that nothing is actually the way that you would have it if you were in control of anything. And so we begin to examine these, mainly at this point from the idea of how we might think of that differently. Do we think that the sense of self that we have and experience in this moment is the same one that we experienced when we were a child? I hear echoes all of the time of people don't change, people are incapable of changing. I had a friend who was Lebanese. They lived in Beirut, and there was a big emphasis on staying the same, staying true, staying faithful. And so one of the great insults that you could hurl at somebody was, "You've changed." And that's so contrary to the nature of everything. There was a piece in the paper this morning about how very different people are from their younger self to their older self. How all of that life, all of that conditioning affects the perception of self and perception of world, and that you can be a very different, almost unrecognizable person from your early life to your later life. So in the beginning of this exploration, we're really looking at the ways in which we hold tightly to this, that we grip onto it so that we can feel a sense of security in knowing that this is us, that we can feel a sense of security in knowing that we can set up our lives in such a way that they won't change so that they become unrecognizable to us. And that we have this idea that we can get what we want, and in getting what we want, there'll be a sense of satisfaction in that. And what we want to begin to do is open up to see how tightly gripped we are onto this idea of a solid self, that you can protect yourself and prevent yourself from changing or aging or dying. When you do this in a meditation practice, of course, you're paying attention to these. In Vipassana, we divide everything up and look at the individual strands that come together into this tapestry that creates the perception of ourselves and the world as a solid thing. We notice the sensing experience, and often in the beginning of practice, we're able to notice it only as these fixated things, these solid things. We don't notice that they come from this undifferentiated, unfixated place, and then we attach to them and create this solidness, this perception of solidness. And as you touch into that and focus more and more on that becoming conceptual reality experience, what you begin to notice is that there's a lot of energy in the sensing process, and that it's largely unfixated. And so you move into this next place of focus in practice, which is on the nature of impermanence. Shinzen, my longtime teacher in the Vipassana, and in the Theravada meditation strategies, calls it flow. So the energy of unfixated time and space, sensing experience, just flowing, a kind of vibratory energy. And so we begin to turn toward that and intentionally look for that activity of impermanence, and make that the object of meditation, and then allow it to begin to dissolve the perception of solidness that we may have, so that we can move into this capacity, really, or this ability to fixate things when we need them to be solid, and then not fixate them when we don't need them to be solid. This movement between fixating and unfixating, the move between manifesting a brilliant sense of self and allowing that sense of self to dissolve, really seeing clearly that it's this attachment that we make to the undifferentiated sensing experience, which causes the perception of solid self and solid world, and that they're constantly changing based on the conditions of the present moment, what's there and what causes them to arise. So we just have this movement of arising and passing. In the Theravada map, this is the fourth stage, and it's a stage that is accompanied by very high concentration. And that wherever you turn your attention, you can see very clearly the arising and passing. One of the ways that we, in the untrained mind, are able to create this perception of ongoing self and world is that we only notice the arising. So each time the sensing activity arises, we focus on that. And then rather than watching it peak and then fall away, we jump to the next arising, to the next arising. And if there aren't sufficient arisings, we jump to awareness to act as a bridge that carries us from arising to arising to arising. And in this manner of perceiving things, you can create this sense of solid world, solid self, ongoing, unending. And so as we move into this fourth stage of practice where we're looking at these arisings and passings, we pay attention to the ending of it, noticing the arising, the middle, the end, the arising, the middle, the end. And in paying attention in that way, we see clearly or it's illustrated clearly for us, the nature of this arising and passing. In Christian?
I'm wondering when you're tracking, say, the passing or any of the phases, are you actually aware of sort of where you are in the timeline of that sensation or feeling at the time, or do you kind of just realize that, like, can you really realize that something is passing while it's passing, or do you only realize that it has passed?
The way that Shinzen formulated the meditation was to note gone at the moment that it ends. So a significant drop off or an ending of a sensation is denoted as a gone moment. So yes, you do begin to see these waves of arising and passing with a clear ending. And you focus on them. When you move into the fourth stage, really what you're focusing on mainly is the endings or the gones. And so you because you're already conditioned to notice the arising, you just really focus your attention mainly on the endings, on the gones, one after another. The technique is called just note gone, which you can do. Tonight, what I was thinking that we would do instead was flow and add that to the mix of see, hear, feel. If you notice that there's flowing energy, there's always a bias toward focusing on it. So something will drop off significantly or end, and that's a gone. And it's happening all of the time in all of the different sense gates. So if you imagine the last sentence that I just said, after each discrete word, there was a moment of gone when the vibration ended before the next one arose. And you were able to detect the ending of each word, as well as the beginning of each word, in order to understand what I'm saying. So it's a very ordinary thing. One way to do it, of course, is to pay attention to an arising and then restrict your ability to move off the object until you follow the arising and passing of it. And then as it ends, note gone, so that you begin in this slow way of tracking that. And you'll notice in the nature of arising and passing, there's a few different ways that it happens. Most of the time, it's a kind of prosaic, that what I mean is ordinary rhythm of arising and passing, arising and passing. But you may begin to notice as you do the practice that there can be a pulsing energy of arising and passing. and that can happen at different speeds. But it can get so rapid that you're unable to note it and label it at the same time. So you give up on the labeling and just note it directly as it pulses on and off, on and off. And when that kind of flowing energy gets really powerful in the body, it's as if the whole experience of self and world is pulsing and arising and passing in that way. Is that making sense? In the fourth stage, they talk about an experience of an arising and passing event, which is some clear indication that that you know this activity of arising and passing. And in the Mahasi commentary, he talks about it as a white light, a kasina that opens up, almost like a spotlight. When I first had the experience of it, I was reminded of those gangster films from my childhood. I recognize that I'm quite a bit older, and that the nature of gangster films has changed quite a bit since then. But in these black and white movies that were made in the 30s and the 40s, the gangsters all wore, suits and fedoras, and the police detectives also wore them, ties, and they would sit the suspect in a chair, and then they would turn the desk lamp up, which had kind of a gooseneck thing with a shade on a bulb, and then you have that direct bulb, that bare bulb with white light blazing in your face, and that had that sense of it. I talk about it because it was such an unusual experience, and I was completely unprepared for it, because Shinzen at the time was teaching a kind of secular mindfulness, and so there was no conversation about these different stages that you might end up in. And it had seemed to me that somebody had driven their car and parked it across from me where I was sitting in the meditation hall, and had left the headlights on. Even though I knew that it was impossible to drive a car there, I had this idea that must be what had happened, and I became quite outraged by the moral failings of the person who drove the car and then left their headlights on. So I opened my eyes, and of course there was nothing there, and the room was in almost a twilight state of light. And so I closed my eyes, and then as the concentration returned, the bright white kasina appeared. And in that moment, wherever I turned my attention, the arising and passing was absolutely vividly clear and rapid. And it didn't matter how fast it was going, because the mind was capable of taking it in. And as that continued, the sense of the fluidity of experience began to give way, and it became quite staccato. Everything has gone digital now, but in the old days, in using another movie idea, sometimes you'd go to the theater and the film would break, and then you would see the succession of the flowing, moving image becoming these choppy cells of still images before it turned white. And that's kind of how it was. The fluidity of that constant sense of motion became quite staccato-y. And that's called an arising and passing point, where you see through the matrix, if we can use yet another film analogy, the nature of that sensing experience and the way that we create conceptual reality from it. And it produces that sense of the solid world out there that's flowing in this continuous way and appears to be solid. The reaction often from that happening can be fearfulness. And so what you'll notice sometimes when you get into that stage of insight, that as those experiences begin to happen to you, and you notice that it makes you quite fearful, and that fearfulness shuts it down and brings everything back into that ordinary sense of solidness. And so you have to acclimatize to the experience of this. As the arising and passing takes over the whole sensing experience, you move into what's called dissolution, which is where the capacity to sense the edges of the body disappears into this flowing energy. The capacity to differentiate between the individual sense gates of see, hear, feel dissolves, and you're simply this flowing, unfixated sensing experience. And then that can go on for various periods of time. Also, it can be easily shut down by fearfulness arising in reaction to it. It is an ordinary state that happens over and over again, so you tend to cycle through it. If you like this particular map that the Theravada Insight Path is based on, then you simply get used to where you are on the map and know what techniques to apply to it, so that you can begin to move through these and do a cycle of the whole map over and over again. Recognizing these experiences as you repeat them, and cycling through this becomes more and more obvious, and so less and less frightening, and so you can move into more complete dissolution states. You often, or I do anyway, talk to people who have gotten partway through, but not all the way through, because the fearfulness came and shut it down. I like to describe this as a way of practicing so you have a sense of the ordinariness of it. One of the things that's important to understand about the nature of practice is that you tend to have the kinds of insights that the practice that you're doing tends to cause to arise. And so if you practice closely with this particular map, then and do the techniques that are necessary to have the insights that are described in it, then you tend to move along the map in the way that it's described. If you look at the monastic texts and the way that Mahasi writes, it's very emphatic and very rigid in terms of how the experiences tend to unfold. But I noticed that in my own practice that they unfold in different ways. There's, depending on how I'm moving through the cycle, different emphases. Sometimes more than one stage is present. You're moving back and forth through stages. The dissolution experience then becomes not unpleasant, but pleasant and welcome, because it's familiar and it doesn't frighten you, and you can enjoy the change in the experience of being that is illustrated by it. And you have more agency in being able to be come in and out of it. At the end of the dissolution stage is the knowledge of the miseries, is the Buddhist term for it. It's often discussed with the Christian terminology, which is the dark night of the soul. We don't really have a soul in Buddhist thought, and the miseries are around the same three characteristics that you've already examined. The fearfulness that there is no self-experience that's ongoing. The misery that nothing lasts and you can't count anything. You're going to lose everything. Maybe you know the 5 remembrances. I'm of a nature to grow old. There's nothing I can do to prevent aging. I am of a nature to grow sick. There's nothing you can do to prevent becoming ill. I am of a nature to die. There's nothing you can do to prevent death. Everything I have and everyone I love is of the nature to change. There's nothing I can do to prevent losing them. My only true possessions are my actions. There's no way to escape the consequences of my actions. And then the last is the disgust that you're trapped in a human body that's going to age, and that beautiful, youthful, vibrant, energetic container that you start life with doesn't last either. I like to relate to that with humor, because the decrepitude as it creeps up is hilarious. That's why this article in the paper this morning was so enjoyable, because it's so easy to convince yourself that you're basically unblemished and unchanged by a whole lifetime of experience, and yet these researchers were demonstrating how completely different older people think than their younger selves might have thought. So the idea is to understand that this is a description, and that different practices provide different maps. The Tibetan map is completely different from this. The Zen map is completely different from this. One of the things, actually, in retrospect about studying with Shinzen, is that he has a fusion of these three different maps, and it's all secularized, so it's hard to tell from the languages he uses what tradition he's drawn the particular teaching out of. I study with Dan Brown, who's in the Rimé lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, which is part of the Bon lineage. And Dan, when I first started studying with him, described it as the greatest hits of Tibetan Buddhism, in that they plucked from each of the different 5 traditions the practices that they thought were the most successful in illustrating the stages of the development of their path. And so you weren't confined to a single lineage. You had this kind of mashup of all of the 5 Tibetan lineages, which actually was very appealing to me, having spent so long studying with Shinzen, where that had happened, even though it hadn't been so clearly explained. All roads lead to Rome. All roads lead to enlightenment. And really what we're talking about here is picking up and practicing in a way that really resonates with you, so that you'll continue practicing and carry yourself along to this end place. In the Tibetan practices, you have a taste of awakening, and then the journey is to stabilize that awakening until it's continuous. In the Theravada map, you have stream entry, and then you develop the first stage, or the first taste of enlightenment, until it's a stable thing. And in Zen, you walk through the mist of awakening until you're drenched in the same way that you would if you plunged into the experience of cessation in the Theravada map. So you're going to come to practice and identify ways of practicing that really make sense to you, so that you can engage them, knowing that what we're trying to come into is this place of deeply integrating the understanding of the nature of the way that we experience self and world. That we take in this sensing data through the capacities that we have, that mind is very selective on what it focuses on. So based on our the hierarchies of meaning that we find in experiences, we collect these mind moments out of the full range of possibilities that are there. We take this very limited sampling of what's there, and we create, based on our conditioning and our imagination, a version of that that's conceptual, that conceptual reality, and that we project that out and form the world around us and the perception of the people that are in our lives, and that it's coming from that process of taking in the raw data, fixating it, and projecting it back out, which is very different than the way that the Western mind is conditioned to understand these things. Going back to ancient Greece and the philosophers there, understanding that their idea of this was that we look out and we take in representations of what's out there, and that they're accurate representations that we're taking in. It's a very different way of looking at this. And so one of the things that's important for Western practitioners is to understand that you've been conditioned, you've been taught how to see the construction of the world, you've been taught how to see the construction of yourself and the other people in your life. And in Buddhism, we're thinking that it's different than that you have to train your way into seeing it. As far as I can tell, the way that it actually is, whereas the standard Western idea is not actually a good model for it. At least in the way I experience things, I'm aware that I can create the sense of the world around me in a variety of ways, many of which are completely inaccurate as to what's actually happening there. An example would be getting an email from somebody and reading it and getting an immediately strong emotional response to the content of the email, and having trained myself not to immediately respond to it, because I'm recognizing that the emotional intensity of the reaction to it has distorted my capacity to see clearly what's actually there, and waiting until the emotional storm has settled so that I can come back to it and re-examine what it is and attempt to understand why it created such reactivity, and then what might be an appropriate response, which is often different than the intensity of the feeling that was the initial reaction to it. But while that's very discrete, that kind of process is happening over and over again as we move through the day. And so trying to come into this place of balance, and then allowing the reactivity that's still present in you not worked out, so that you can maintain this perfect equanimity, and then become skillful in this habit of needing to have that clarity of mind so that the intention can be clean and ethical, and that the action that you take can be clean and ethical, so that the karmic traces that you create are also skillful, and that you can move into this virtuous cycle of being. So in the meditation that we're going to do a repeat of the basic see, hear, feel, focus in, focus out, focus, rest. The reason that the rest aspect is important is that sometimes your attention can be drawn to a sensate that is inactive. So we want to have space for that. Most of the time when that happens to me, it's internal visual thinking, but there's no activation of internal visual thinking. It's just an awareness of the space. This allows us to move from identifying with the content of activations to an awareness of the space and whether or not the space is active. The focus in, focus out creates that differentiated experience of self and world. And then we want to begin to pay attention to the nature of flow experiences or impermanent experiences. In the canon and also in descriptions of jhana practice, you'll notice, if you look into it, that they tend to describe this flow energy, this piti is the Pali word for it, in 5 levels of intensity, the first of which is just a very subtle vibratory, maybe goose flesh type vibratory activity somewhere in the body. And so as you sit in the meditation practice, pay attention to that. And if you notice it, then begin to switch your attention to it. There's always a bias in practice of switching to the flow states because you want to be really have some agency in moving from fixated to flowing back and forth effortlessly. The second stage is a kind of jolting energy that flows through the body so that it almost causes the body to jerk as it flows through. The third level is this suffusing energy that flows. So the whole body becomes energized by this. The fourth stage is this uplifting energy. This is one of those things, until I went to Asia, really didn't know what they were talking about it. It seemed like a metaphor or a description of the metaphysical, which was, for me, a little bit harder since I've been so inured to the science as miracle paradigm. And I even explained it to myself in terms of that is that the flow state hits the proprioceptive system, which is how we know how the body is positioned. And if that begins to flow quite a bit, then the body is trying to rebalance itself based on that. But that it was not so unusual for people to literally lift off the cushion. So they're if they were kneeling, which is a common posture there, their legs and feet would be on the ground, but the rest of the body would lift up and float above the floor in front of them in a posture that we tried to duplicate consciously but couldn't find balance to hold, and they would hover a few inches off the floor, their face a few inches off the floor in this forward posture that and be there for 20 minutes or 30 minutes, which seemed quite impossible. That's that intensity of energy. And when I quizzed some of them afterwards, they said that it just felt that they were floating rather than having extended forward. That was surprising. And then the fifth one is this energy that completely dissolves the barrier between sense gates and also the inside and outside, so that you are no longer able to detect the body. But in the beginning, when you're sensitizing yourself to flow or PT, you're looking just for this little bit of vibratory energy, and if that happens, switch to that. You can begin to denote it as see flow, hear flow, or feel flow. See flow, the visual field would break up into colored dots. The internal experience is a little easier, where the imagery is just flowing and morphing continuously. In auditory, you no longer fixate the soundscape, and it just becomes pure vibratory energy without the mind making it into something. So just sound, no words, no identifying activity. And then in the body, there's this flow of energy that begins to become so intense that the body itself dissolves. Is that pretty clear in terms of what this evening's practice is going to be? Any questions before we begin? So any comments or questions about what we did this evening? Christian?
I'm wondering about the visual see in and see out rest. Is there a rest for both of those? Because for a while I was just kind of like looking at the blank screen, and it's not like, sometimes I'll get little blobbies dancing, but there was just nothing there. And so I thought that that was see out rest, but I wasn't sure if it was see out rest or see in rest.
I would say that's see in rest. See out rest would be more an awareness of like the eyelids with no activity because they're closed. So that would be see out rest. Or if you were in a room that was dark and it was hard to see anything, then you might notice the see out rest. The visual activity when the eyes are open, if there's light in the space, is usually pretty active. See and rest, the mental screen is often the place where I notice it, whereas the other aspects of see and rest, see in are usually active.
Okay.
Arthur.
I noticed that it's very rarely, I actually can't tell when there's a rest, because usually if I'm, in sight space, then another space will just pop in instead. So I go to sound, and then it will go to sensation. So it's very little of actual, like, any of them resting.
Right.
And my sense is because the other one's like captures my attention, it takes over. So I don't really. So I guess, how do you stay with the rest part of it?
I wouldn't intentionally direct, I wouldn't intentionally direct that choice. Just have it in mind in case you arrive there. In shorts, it's like this, there tends to be much more activation, but if you sit longer, say on a retreat where you're sitting for hours a day, then very gradually you tend to get into more and more periods of restful states until you can actually get into a place where it's just all rest. So no visual activity, the body is completely relaxed, it doesn't really react too much. And then it's quiet, so there's no activation. And then the internal auditory thinking shuts down, and so you're just in a sort of an equanimous space with no activations, but awareness is still there. All rest states is possible. Really, just having that as part of the thing to note, if you end up there, is better than trying to direct toward it, I would say. You don't want to interflow. You don't want to interfere with the movement of the mind from object to object. You want to be able to observe that more. If you couldn't identify a rest state, then you might do a short period of with a restricted meditation where you were just focusing on that to learn the space. But once you know what the experience is, I would just go back to the freely moving. Good enough? Someone else? Okay, so it is the middle of November. We have a day long for the Dharma maps coming up. We talked about that a lot tonight anyway, but this will be a day of practice, really mostly focusing on the different stages and the different techniques that you use on them. Might even be next Saturday, let me look. So yeah, Saturday the 21st. This Saturday is the 14th, so it's the 21st, so not this week. Not coming. December 3rd, we're starting a level 2 class. So if you're interested in the meditation and attachment material, there's some spaces there left. We have some scholarship funds for that. So take a look at it and see if you want to do it. And then give us a shout at the office and we can set it up for you. If you haven't done level 1 and you still are interested in doing the course, we can give you the recordings for level 1 so that you can go through them before it starts. We have a weekend retreat in conjunction with the Recovery Dharma Collective. I'm going to do the meditation and attachment for addiction over a day and a half, so all day Saturday and half of a day on Sunday. That training is divided up into 4 modules, working with craving and urging, working with stress, anger, and depression, working with persistent negative emotions, and working with difficult interpersonal relationships. So we think that the underlying cause of addiction is meditation, an attachment disturbance, and so that course is reflective of that, and it gives you a full range of that perspective. And it's equivalent to level 1. So if you wanted to do that, you could do that. The level 2 class is starting before that, so I wouldn't let that inhibit you. But if you have addiction issues, it's a wonderful approach to that. We have a retreat coming up December 28th through January 2nd. It's a virtual retreat, so you can do it from anywhere. And that's also about half full. The level 2 class is restricted to 12, and the retreat is restricted to 24. So if you're interested in doing that, sign up sooner than later, because we really will close them just because of the logistics of it. There's also some scholarship money available for the retreat. I offer this class on a dana basis. Dana is the Pali word for generosity, which means I offer the teaching freely, and then I hope that you'll donate to help support me and also to help support the work that Mettagroup is doing. Any amount is appreciated, and if you're not resourced at this time, that's totally fine. Please come to the classes and the community will support you. There's a link for donations on the website and also in the email you may have gotten about the class. Thank you for coming, and we will see you next time. Bye now.
Thanks, George.
Thanks, Harley. Bye.